Hello and welcome to this emergency Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues Kieran Pedley and Cameron Garrett to discuss the announcement that Nigel Farage is officially back. Hi both.
Hey Holly.
So how significant a moment do we think this is as an announcement a couple of weeks into the campaign?
Well, look, you can never be certain, but I think in election campaigns, there's a lot of noise punctuated by events that can have a very, very significant impact indeed. And I think this is likely to be one of them. We know that the Conservative Party have been leaking support to reform throughout this Parliament. What was unclear was whether that support was going to materialise on election day. Nigel Farage playing a high-profile role in this election campaign has the potential to mean reform does deliver on some of the vote shares we've been seeing in opinion polls. Our data at Ipsos shows they take about 8 in 10 of their support from 2019 Conservative voters, and those switching from the Conservatives to reform prioritise immigration overwhelmingly as their number one issue. 70% say that, or 7 in 10 say that. So now you've got one of the most high-profile champions of the Leave vote in 2016 and of that Brexit coalition playing a frontline role in this election campaign at a time when 2019 Conservatives say they're extremely unhappy with Sunak's government's ratings on how he's handled the topic of immigration. So all of that put together, makes me think this could be a highly significant moment in the campaign.
Yeah, it feels like just like a week and a half ago when he said he wasn't standing, lots of people were saying him not standing is an early win for the Tories, is good for them. So, but the very fact he is now kind of means the reverse, and it means he's going to be able to play a very prominent role in this. It means there's kind of been questions when he was on Question Time. It was like it felt a bit weird that he was there and not a party leader or even standing, and now it's going to allow him to play that prominent role. Without that, he's going to be allowed on the TV debates, the 7-part TV debates that they do, and it means he's going to be able to put his voice forward more prominently.
I think the other thing I would add to that is when you think about these, there's obviously two types of leader debates, right? There's the Starmer and Sunak head-to-heads, and then there's the ones where sort of, I think it's 7 party leaders are on stage, or sort of party members, it should be said, they're not all leaders, at the BBC on Friday, I think it is. When you cast your mind back to equivalent debates of that nature in the past few election campaigns, you've had many more big hitters on, the Nicola Sturgeon, Caroline Lucas, people like this. It does feel like that's the stage that Nigel Farage is going to find it fairly easy to dominate. No shade on Penny Mordaunt and Angela Rayner and others there, but it just feels like with some of the smaller parties, they're much less high profile now in terms of who's going to be their spokespeople than Nigel Farage certainly is. And it all comes back to that 2019 coalition that supported Boris Johnson. I had a piece out last week on how that's fracturing in so many different directions. The big question was, can the Conservatives, eat into that Conservatives to Reform switcher group and then maybe turn their attention to others? This just makes it so much more difficult.
And I think we did see a couple of those politicians who were lined up, as you said, Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt announced earlier in the day today to be part of that debate on Friday night. I don't think they will have been aware that Nigel Farage was also probably likely to be partaking in that debate at the same time. It'll be interesting now to see who the other parties put forward to take him on, if he's got kind of a 7 p.m, 8 p.m. slot on national television at the weekend. I think what's interesting as well is how Nigel Farage as an individual polls with 2019 Conservative voters. You've obviously said earlier, Kieran, that Reform are taking kind of 8 in 10 of their votes from the Conservative Party, and Farage himself, when we polled him previously, has been relatively popular in comparison to other Conservative figures. I think when we did some polling in March, his favourability rating was second only to the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at that point, and that was prior to us having seen Rishi Sunak's personal favourability ratings plummet even further. So potentially a shrewd move from Reform UK to have him as the leader of the party, as the most kind of prominent figure, although, I mean, some people would argue he had kind of already been that, and Richard Tice handing over the leadership so that Nigel Farage can be more prominent during the campaign, isn't necessarily as kind of big a deal to like normal people potentially as other people, because they're the person that they'll have been seeing on the news anyway and being the spokesperson for Reform UK. How do we think it's going to affect or impact the polls that we've got to come, if at all? Do we think there's going to be any movement towards reform off the back of this? Is it too small an announcement? Do we think it's got the potential to squeeze either the Labour or Conservative votes in either direction?
Well, it's worth bearing in mind that reform have been dropping a bit lately. So, I suspect what you'll see a slight uptick. What's a bit unclear is obviously what we do need to see in truth is the nature of Farage's campaign and how much he can dominate the airwaves in the next couple of weeks. The first leaders' debate is tomorrow, right? And that is Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So, we do know in general elections that smaller parties tend to get squeezed. I think just the sense before we even get into what, how much reform support may or may not increase, I think the most significant moment of this announcement is it just makes that reform vote harder for the Tories to squeeze. And, we talked, without repeating myself, we talked in the first week of the campaign about how these national service announcements and announcements on pensions looked like they were all very much aimed at sort of striking whilst the iron was hot and trying to take some of that sort of floating reform vote back. Cameron made a very good point that one of the reasons this election was probably called for July was to try and catch reform out. And now that's obviously, much, much more difficult.
I do think there's an interesting question about the significance of this in the longer term as well. Say Farage wins, he's going to be in Parliament as the Conservatives are dealing with their next leadership vote, etc. And I think that's probably playing a role in this. He wants to be kind of in the room where it happens. And lots of people talking about, could he be Conservative leader one day? Well, getting a seat in Parliament is kind of vital for that. I'm not saying he will, but I think it might be something that's ticking over in his mind.
And if that were to be the case, or even if it's not the case throughout the next 5 weeks, he's going to be able to have an influence in the issues agenda, right? We know that given his speech that we heard a few moments ago, immigration is a key issue that he is keen to highlight and keen to tackle, as are the Party of Reform UK in general. And we know from our polling from our issues index that currently immigration is fourth on the list of kind of the most important issues to people. But if you ask 2019 Conservative voters, it jumps right up to the top. So there's the potential for immigration to be getting a bit more attention than it potentially previously would have. I think it's fair to say. And I think maybe it's Labour, who have been relatively vague in their announcements so far in the immigration space, that could potentially struggle to counter that a little, particularly in the context of debates and having to speak publicly about policies and what the commitments are opposite Nigel Farage.
Yeah, and I think you make it's an absolutely critical point, Holly. And one of the things that we talked about when we released our Ipsos campaign tracker last week, we asked head-to-head, which party do you think has the best policies on a range of key issues? You mentioned, obviously, there's the consistent top four that come out: cost of living, NHS, economy, immigration. With immigration, we're always at pains to say that whilst Labour has a lead over the Conservatives on it, in reality, a majority of the public don't choose either party. There is that space there. And so I think it's really potentially quite significant, what role does immigration now play in this campaign? At Ipsos, we talk a lot about how the issues can lead the politics as much as the politics can lead the issues, right? So if immigration becomes a bigger factor in this campaign, that can have quite sizable political implications too.
Final thoughts then. Over the next 5 weeks and I guess longer term, what do we think the impact of this Farage announcement, both as the leader of Reform UK and standing for, I think it's an 8th time to be an MP? Is he going to get it over the line this time? Are there going to be celebrations in Clacton for everyone to join at some point? Or is it not going to move the dial too much and actually not as many people are going to be paying attention to this as we think?
I imagine it will move the dial slightly. I'll be looking out for the voting intention polls over the next week or so. The hypothetical polling that has happened shows it does lead to a small boost in support for reform. So I would expect that to happen, but we kind of have to wait and see.
Yeah, I always said with reform, the difference with the Brexit Party is almost the party name. It's a bit of a vague brand. What is it? What is it for? And I think now it's the Nigel Farage Party, then that makes it a lot easier for them. I suspect it will move the dial, I think. But again, I would just repeat the point. The significance of this isn't just in the fact that whether reform goes up 5 points or not. I think there's scope for that to happen, maybe not straight away, but throughout the campaign, just because of the significance of immigration with that 2019 Conservative coalition. But I do think also the significance of this is almost what doesn't change. We've talked about how the polling hasn't changed much in the first week of the campaign. I don't want to labour the point or repeat the point over and over again. But in reality, the fact that it's going to be much harder for the Conservatives to squeeze reform now makes that sort of wipeout landslide Labour victory a lot more plausible. Whereas I think most of us, or I can only speak for myself, most of us have been waiting for the polls to narrow, have been thinking, maybe reform gets squeezed. This makes it a lot harder.
That's all we've got time for. Thanks to Kieran Pedley and Cameron Garrett for joining me on this Emergency Politics Talk podcast. And stay tuned in the next couple of days for our first Political Monitor release of the campaign and more polls to come throughout the next 5 weeks.